Hello, everyone. This is John Salomon with the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Welcome to the latest in our series of informal video chats with interesting people with interesting things to say in an interesting industry, which is anything related to information security, risk management, and similar topics, whether it's technology, policy, threats, risks, anything that could potentially be of value to furthering the maturity of the industry and the sector and helping make everybody safer and more resilient. I'm here today with Jonathan Srugo. Now, Jonathan is a fellow member of an investment collective called the Cyber Club London. He's, like myself, an independent consultant based in Western Europe. And the thing we're going to be talking about today is online gaming and gambling and information security challenges and implications. A topic that's frequently overlooked. Some of you who, like ourselves, have been doing this for many, many years may remember tremendous amounts of DDoS activity and extortion hitting, for example, South America-based gambling, online gambling back, 10, 15, 20 years ago. But it's not an area that, people in financial services or other critical industry sectors are really often exposed to. So we're going to do an informal back and forth. I'll ask Jonathan a few questions. And I'd like to start out with maybe a quick introduction overview. What's your background? Who are you? Where do you come from? And why are we talking?
All right. So thanks, John. Great to be here. And obviously an interesting topic, an interesting industry, and a fascinating experience that I had in that industry. And happy to share anything I can in order to help. So I've been in the information cybersecurity industry, intelligence, fraud prevention for around 21 years now. I started my first half of my career in heavily regulated environments and relatively slowly moving environments such as banking, credit card industries back in the early 2000s. Then slowly moved on to telecom. So the first part of my career was mainly around, what we call shift left today, the people that are sitting and defining the risks and trying to proactively prevent something from going in, and without, I would say, too much involvement in the operational world. But again, with a heavy focus on risk management and trying to put in place good policies and procedures throughout the organization and throughout the development life cycle as well. And then the latter part of my career, which is the past 10 years, is heavily on the extreme right-hand side of cyber and information security in production, incident response, crisis management, dealing with hackers, dealing with a lot of very, very interesting issues on a 24/7 basis, is where I've learned most of my practical technical experience, which has been fascinating, mainly around sports betting, gambling, gaming, etc.
So I'll start out with a fairly provocative approach, which I think exactly what's coming. Gambling is one of these things that it is a reality. Everybody or a lot of people do it. And in that way, it's frankly similar to alcohol and drugs and prostitution and guns and things like that. They're a fact of life without making a moral judgment. A lot of people do make moral judgments. It's also something that, various regulators, some of them extremely well-meaning, they have, let's just say, sometimes very strict attitudes towards. How is that shaped, or has that shaped your approach to being able to work with, for example, national cybersecurity agencies in terms of getting support for when you have cybersecurity issues, and have you seen any issues from the fact that if you're, for example, facing a certain threat, you're coming from a gaming company? Has that affected your ability to respond, to bring help in, work with vendors even, etc.?
Absolutely. So some amazing question. So a true example, 2014, we're getting DDoSed on a regular basis, and companies in the gaming industry getting emails from Akamai that have just purchased or just bought Prolexic, saying, okay, we're not going to protect you anymore because we don't do gambling. Thank you very much. You have 2 weeks. And suddenly you find yourself scrambling and trying to protect your global network. And this is an example of how working with suppliers has been limiting. And Akamai has been known for many, many years, up until recently, not to favor working with gaming and gambling companies. That's one example. The other example is that dating back to the first half of my career, I was working with law enforcement on a regular basis and with CISRTs on a regular basis, but then moving to this gaming and gambling industry, I was more dependent on my third-party suppliers than I was dependent. I couldn't be dependent on law enforcement and on kind of CSIRTs. You basically have to be very, very creative, be able to work extremely well under extreme pressure, and work with your suppliers. Your suppliers are your best friends when you work in this industry, because they're the ones that are learning the threats from you. You are the one that is feeding them ideas for their new features in their product. And that personal relationship is really, really important. I mean, I found myself spending a lot of time visiting my suppliers and doing brainstorming workshops on what we can do to prevent an issue that we're seeing in our network. So I think it's a great question, because it's the difference between operating in an environment where you've got a good relationship with these law enforcement and everything, to more working with suppliers.
I think there's a very, very important lesson in there, and I'm sorry to jump right in with the sledgehammer question.
Yeah.
The reason I asked that is knowing full well what the answer was going to be. There's a very, very important thing to consider for law enforcement, CSIRTs, security vendors, regulators, governments, and that is, in a way, even if a gambling company is legal, if you're in a jurisdiction where online gambling and gaming is totally legal, it is in the same class of potential victims as your gray market and your black market economy. And this is the thing that we've seen over centuries in regular conventional fraud, where if you don't protect these people, then they're fair picking for fraudsters, for organized crime, for terrorist groups, because they think that you're not going to help them. So that's going to affect everybody in the long term. So I think my personal view is, I think it's a good attitude for government agencies, especially, to put their moral objections aside, because they have no place in this.
Yeah.
What kind of concrete threats were you facing in that role? You mentioned DDoS, and that's one that we've seen with online gaming quite a bit. Are you seeing extortion? Did you see ransomware? What kind of actors and attacks were you looking at?
Okay, so I'd like to break down the whole availability aspect into several things, because most people think about DDoS and they say, okay, DDoS, the volumetric attacks, blah 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 blah. But again, there's other aspects that nobody really talks about, and it's obviously more prevalent in specific industry, specific territories. Sorry, but there's various forms of denial of service attacks. It doesn't have to be through volumetric network floods. It could be through things such as, and yes, they do exist, PGP hijacking, DNS manipulation and interception, specifically in some countries, without going into names, where you can find either government entities, or in some cases even commercial entities, using, not afraid to say, bribery of local internet service providers to manipulate traffic to their own favor. So this has nothing to do with volumetric floods. This has to do with controlling the DNS infrastructure.
And I have to actually jump in with a question there. Were these, when you say state actors, or let's say state affiliated or state tolerated, were these, how do we put this diplomatically, were these generally from the countries that we would tend to classify as the usual suspects for the bad guys online? Or did you also ever see any from, let's say, more legitimate countries, developed countries? I'm choosing my words very carefully.
Yeah.
simply didn't like the offshore nature compared to their infrastructure ecosystem of your guys' very existence?
So it depends. And it's a really good question because obviously the usual suspects are the ones, it's actually the ones that we've seen um, the manipulation of traffic for commercial benefits, right? And in other countries, it's more about, we just don't like this type of traffic. Let's make it go away. But yeah, and of course, some other examples, such as usage of specific in-country malware prevention tools to disallow traffic to your site based on content categories. That's another form. Or marking your download executables as malware. So these are other forms of denial of service attacks, which are not what Akamai and Imperva and all these guys are writing about. Very, very quiet, but disastrous in nature. And I think we're going to see this a lot now in the cryptocurrency industry. Again, not trying to move the focus away from gaming and gambling, but any industry that's right now more or less in its infancy, you guys are going to see this as well. And probably you guys are starting to see this as well, okay? Because nobody talks about those things, but they do exist. So this is to answer your questions about the forms of denial of service. I can go on and on, to talk about other categories if you wish, but let me know how much time we have.
As much time as you want to. I do want to mention regarding crypto. That was a really interesting point, actually, and that kind of goes into my argument I was making before, that this, I think this kind of vulnerability, susceptibility is common to a lot of industries and economic areas of activity that are maybe not entirely established or even seen as legitimate. And crypto is a really weird example because you have this confluence of, what I call the tech bros and the finance bros, right? There's a lot of money, brand new technology, the regulatory space and the good practices space are not yet quite established. And as a result, and I think this goes for the whole of what we could call fintech. The whole idea that especially banks and critical infrastructure operators have evolved over decades now of a good approach to risk management and responsible practices just isn't quite there yet. In addition to these not, being entirely well regulated yet. So, a lot of these organizations aren't investing the kind of resources that they need to in protecting themselves. But if you want to talk a little bit more about the kind of attacks that you're seeing, I mean, this is fascinating stuff, and it's something that we're not really that familiar with.
Yeah. So I'm taking a note here because I do want to reply to one of the very, very important things that you said about law enforcement and government agencies. I want to talk about that at the end because it's really, really important how they can really benefit from helping more in this industry. So another form of cybercrime that is really, really prevalent, and I don't know how much is talked about, is content and brand infringement. So obviously what you have to understand that in some of the areas of the world, there's lack of respect to intellectual property. Again, not naming names, but on a regular basis, what you would see is an ongoing campaign of denial of service attacks in their various forms. And on the other hand, a massive campaign of content theft, logo theft, domain squatting, and the capability to basically create a completely new mimicking brand on the side in order to steal traffic. So these would be ongoing campaigns that we would see, where obviously you've had your content scraping, your social media fake accounts, everything that now is considered as digital risk protection by Gartner are things that I've seen dating back to 2014, 2015, which is what is outside of our perimeter that can hurt us. Again, fake emails, fake social media, fake domains, fake websites, fake customer support, mimicking your brand. These things are happening, and there's specific strategies of how to combat them, but there's also specific strategies that in specific jurisdictions just don't work because They couldn't care less. And this is happening. I see some of the enterprise, the EASM and the digital risk companies providing these services nowadays. But this is a lot of open source intelligence gathering and being able to identify your competition outside the perimeter. Really, really fascinating world, but really, really hectic world as well, where your traffic is being stolen also based on propaganda. So it's something really, really important that it cannot be overlooked when it comes to that. Of course, SEO hijacking as well, where, your competitors or, would be using your keywords in their domains and different types of poison and techniques in order to steal traffic away. This is something that's really, really prevalent in specific areas of the world. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment there.
I was going to jump in on the brand and the IP violations, because it occurs to me as somebody who's except for losing a lot of money on stocks, which is not a great advertisement for my participation in an investment group, never gambled online. Never placed a bet online. And I would imagine instinctively that your brand identity and your trust are basically your most valuable attribute.
Absolutely.
Or that stems on your availability and your ability to deliver on when somebody does win something, but also to help them trust that the mechanism is fair, even if it's maybe intransparent. Do you feel in general, across let's say the more established legitimate actors in the industry, that management tended to understand that as that there was this tremendous value in their brand, in their reputation, and did they take appropriate steps to let you and your peers safeguard that?
Yes, I can tell you definitely yes, that at least in my experiences, brand recognition, brand protection was something very, very important. A lot of efforts have been spent to fight cybercrime in this area. A lot of innovative ideas, creativity, which is where the CISO or the technology director needs to work directly with the marketing teams on protecting the brand and educating the customers, educating the consumers how to protect themselves and stay away from threats. Obviously, you have illegitimate actors not only trying to steal traffic, but trying to steal credentials for whatever other reason, which we'll get into next. But definitely, something very, very important is your brand, your authenticity. And again, in some areas of the world, there's a complete lack of respect for that. So yeah, that's something that needs to be done on a daily basis.
And I would actually, that's an interesting segue to a topic that is very interesting, and that is the things like identity theft. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is this more attacking employees or more attacking customers, and what are some impacts?
Yeah, cool. So regarding identity theft and account takeover, we cannot overlook what's been happening for years now in the world of, let's call them the traditional layer 7 types of attacks, but non-OS related, which mean, let's talk about credential stuffing. Let's talk about password spraying and all those attacks that are intended to exfiltrate information and guess information. And obviously, you have to understand that being a very, very competitive industry, gaming, sports betting, such thing as two-factor authentication for your consumers is not necessarily a mandatory aspect, because the key thing is how do you acquire your customers, and how you provide them service that's, you don't want to prevent them from obviously having their.
You got to make it easy for them to access. You got to keep their attention.
Exactly. And now, where you have a login prompt or a registration prompt or a password reset prompt without two-factor authentication, you can only guess what's been happening on a regular basis. So once again, these types of attacks are quiet. Most of the times are quiet, because they're not really targeting availability. They're rather targeting your data and your customer. Again, not only in order to gain competitive advantage, but also obviously to sell the information, and then for some other companies. Oh, hey, do you want a database of X, or hey, do you want a database of Y? So it's really, really important, again, not to overlook that, those aspects, especially in industries that don't mandate two-factor authentication for the consumers.
Did you see any? Did you see any? One of the first articles I read about, DDoS way back when was, again, I mentioned, Central American based offshore gambling operations being hit by extortion actors. Did you see anything along those lines? Did you see any pay up or we'll take you down?
Yes, quite frequently. Sometimes it could just be someone that's disgruntled. Sometimes it could just be, someone that's operating on behalf of a competitor. But I try not to distinguish that over any other form of attack, because my personal agenda is never negotiate with terrorists. So, yeah, it exists. But the key focus is keeping the site online, make sure the customers have a good experience. So yeah, it's just a part of life.
All right. Compared to you're as a consultant, and also in your previous life, you're exposed to a lot of different industries, from financial services to I guess in one case transportation as well. I think telco was one of them, if I recall correctly. Do you see a willingness to invest sufficient resources into see information security and resilience building, risk management as strategically important? And to what degree do you see that in online gaming industry wide compared to these more traditional, established, I don't want to say reputable, but you know what I mean? That people see gaming, some people have this moral judgments, but they see, a telco, and those of us in the industry, we know how ruthless telco negotiations get. So, but do you see a difference in a willingness to invest sufficient resources?
So I don't want to generalize about specific companies, because every specific company has different personas, different perceptions, or whatever. But I can generalize from an industry perspective, and I could say the following: that in gaming, gambling, or any online business where its main channels are online, protecting your brand and protecting your availability is survival. And therefore, there's a lot of attention and investment towards that. Whereas if you're in banking, or if you're in credit cards, then you have other channels, physical channels, or other channels of revenue generation. So you can survive without being online. I mean, you can always go to the bank, you can go to the branch, you can go, there's a point of sale device where you can use. So what I can say is that in online gambling and sports betting, it's just survival, and this is why it's really, really important. It's not a matter of compliance. It's a matter of, yes, we need it. We know we need it, so we will invest in it. I think that's it. I mean, every company, it could be various companies that take it more or less seriously, but I think inherently the fact that it's always needs to be online, and that's the answer.
And I would guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that leadership, especially company leadership of especially the more successful online operators, tend to be more digital natives, tend to have grown up, so they're more comfortable with the idea. And it's interesting that you say that about banks, and this is a constant source of frustration for me, because a bank fundamentally, is about trust. It's about information. It's not about money. Money is a thin layer of green on top, but banks and insurances have always sold this idea: you can trust us, we're solid, we're dependable, and I think we're only now getting to the point where the long-suffering CISOs are becoming more business function, more integrated in business risk management. Whereas, your technology native, your online native companies, like what you're describing, have realized from the start that this is important. So
if I may sneak in a comment, John, it's really, really important to explain. It's not that I think that the more traditional industries don't think cybersecurity is important. I think they're inherently been driven more by compliance rather than from risk, So when you talk to, I don't know, in conversations that I've had over the years, it's more about what do we need to do to make sure we don't get fined by the auditor or by the legislators versus what do we need to do in order to prevent this cyber attack? This is most of the discussions, I've been hearing. It doesn't mean they're not investing time and effort. It just means that the motivation is different. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Absolutely. And this is a common, I mean, at risk of going off on a usual tangent of mine, I show the breakdown of why we do information or cybersecurity. And over the years, it's grown from the geeks doing it to the managers realizing everybody else is doing it, to then the regulators. And that's only now that we've really over the last, I'd say 5 years in the quote unquote traditional industries, financial services, oil, natural gas, and a few others ahead of the curve have realized that, well, beyond what we have to do because the government says we have to do it, which is a good thing, right? Because, the financial guys already had to learn this back in 2007, 2008, when the banks took down the global financial system. And it's the same now on the cybersecurity side where they have to be forced into spending that money. But they are beginning, I think, to come around to the idea that, the integration of risk management frameworks that's not just regulatory driven is a good thing, and it will actually help you avoid losing money and work more efficiently and effectively. So I think that's changing, but your point is absolutely well taken. And I am a huge fan of good regulation for precisely that reason, because very often otherwise they wouldn't do it. Yeah. So one little bit off the wall question, and I am
before that.
Sorry.
Before that. Because you said something really, really important. And I do want to answer the second part of the previous question. And like in any type of relationship and in marriage, there's two sides to each story. It's not only about the organization, it's also about us as security practitioners. I believe that the fact that we are now only starting to grow up as an industry and start speaking in the language of risk management and financial,
talking business,
it's also been our fault, because we haven't been able as security practitioners to speak to those guys in the language that they understand. So it's always been about apocalyptic scenarios and high, medium, lows and apples and oranges. And the marketing guys, the business guys, they don't understand high, medium, low. They understand money. And if we as security practitioners are not able to explain what we're trying to do with money, then it's our fault. And I think one of the main things that I'm seeing, and I'm really, really happy, is that the industry is growing up. Slowly and slowly, you start seeing more CISOs, more people really, really talking about risk and financial exposures and probabilities. And I believe that's going to be the major change. Because if you don't get the CISO or whoever it is, the CIO or CTO, speaking in the same language, there's no engagement. Okay, we'll leave it to you. You know what to do with it. I mean, obviously, I don't care. I don't want to know about it. It's your problem, right?
As long as you give me the budget, sure, but that's the problem,
So I think,
good.
Yeah, that's the second part of the relationship that we as security practitioners have to grow up, because it's also our fault that we didn't implement risk management practices that any other industry has implemented. We're not unique. Then we're not special. Everything. I mean, financial risk.
Guys understand. Yeah, that's a communicating risk. Yeah.
Market risk, operational risk. It's been for years. I mean, it's no different than this is our part, our responsibility. You know what I mean?
The model, the analogy I use a lot is like, it's like owning a car. If you own a car and you're expected to know what to do if the check engine light goes on, you're expected to bring it to the mechanic once every whatever 1,000 kilometers, maybe change a tire, make sure the oil gets changed, but nobody expects you to disassemble and reassemble a whole motor. Whereas the mechanic ought to be able to tell you in terms that you as a customer understand, well, what's important and what's needed, as opposed to explaining, why your big end is gone and how it needs a Hogan clanger to replace the tri-valve gefinculator. Yeah, good, very, very well taken. I think, as you said, both sides really, I think, need to understand their counterparts, mode of communication, mode of thinking. I want to get to you had a point you want to make about law enforcement, but before that, I have one question I want to ask, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to this, but you know, in the 2001-2 .com crash, we saw the porn industry in California experience an influx of some of the best information technology talent, because all the tech startups in the Bay Area were laying off and all these guys were going to Southern California and doing some really incredible tech work. And again, all moral judgment aside, I have none, but I wouldn't have the first idea of how to break into this industry as a technologist, as an expert. So if you're somebody who does information security, how do you contact an online gaming company? Because it sounds like an extremely challenging, fast-moving environment.
Yeah. So good question. I don't have the answer, because again, before I got into this role, I didn't even know too much about the industry, to be honest. I mean, I knew it existed. You know, I remember myself as a child, but I mean, I lived in the US, and my parents would go to Las Vegas, and there was always that wall that you're not allowed to cross, and all the lights in the casino, of course, not speaking about online, but you're not allowed. It's always been a dream for me to see that. But question, you just need to, know the right people, I guess. I didn't know about the industry too well. I got to it by accident, and it's been a joyride ever since.
It's really, I mean, it's for me, as again, somebody who knows absolutely nothing about it, except, as you just said, it exists. It's a fascinating idea of, this whole environment that has the things that you and I do professionally for many years now as a core need. I wouldn't have the first idea of who to contact if I wanted to go for work for a company like that, or even where, so. Yeah. So I think as our last question, you want to make a point about law enforcement. And I think for me, that is one of the seminal things to come out of this, really is the challenges, but also opportunities of working with the people that are supposed to be protecting, us, the industry, whatever that industry is. So this is your opportunity to make some noise.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's more law enforcement rather than research and CSIRTs. Whereas I really think that if the CSIRTs tap into those industries, they can learn a lot of the new emerging threats, they can then apply their thinking and their policies towards organizations that are more in the national security area, and protecting critical infrastructure. So I think they have a lot to learn. It's almost like they're testing better the learning ground or their environment where they can see new and emerging threats, and then apply some of those principles to environments that are really about protecting our society. So I think that this could be a really, really good area that these guys can tap into just to learn.
That's a great. I love that. I really like that point. So for our friends in the NCSC and CISO, whether government, nonprofit or commercial sector environments, this is a great motivation to talk to not only, I think, online gaming, but any sector that is maybe not as traditionally integrated into your collective defense scenarios, but is essentially, because of its vulnerability and its attractiveness, almost a petri dish of for threats, for TTPs, for new malware, for actors to identify. So that's a great thing to wrap up on. And if anybody from law enforcement or CERTs is watching this, then you know who to talk to. So Jonathan, I'd like to thank you very much for this enormously informative, in fact, a fascinating chat about something that I before you and I began talking, I hadn't really thought about. I will, as usual, put all the information that I'm allowed to share about you in the video description. Please don't hesitate to check out our website at cybersecurityadvisors.network, and the rest of our YouTube channel, which is full of some really interesting conversations with very knowledgeable people across the industry. And with that, I hope your electricity goes back on, and wish you a very successful rest of the week, and hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.